All right, gang, so it's time. We've got to mount a Model A rear spring to our rear end over there. Simple, you say. Nope. No, it's not. Not at all. So let's talk about a couple of things here, fellas, that we got to contend with, and some assumptions I'm gonna have to make. Let's go. Couple things to observe here. This is a Model A spring, but it's definitely aftermarket. It's reversed eye, meaning the eyes go up. We've got this Model T spring we can compare it to. Standard eye spring, curls around like that. Reverse eye, curls around like that. Model A reversed eye spring. I went ahead and pulled 2 leaves out because that should basically like soften the ride. We can always add them back in if we need to go back up. Now, here's what's complicated. I don't know from whence this spring came. All I know is it's aftermarket. That's a problem. Because I have done my research on this thing. It is 39 center to center on the eyes. Now, the Posey springs are 39.5 to 39.75, depending on which one you get. But this is not a Posey spring because it does not have the patented Posey's super slide thing. Now, it may be a Posey's thing from way back in the day. Also, this could be a Speedway spring that they no longer make. It could be somebody else's spring they no longer make. Now, originally, when I got all of this stuff together in parts, this thing was mounted with Pete and Jake's shackles, and Pete and Jake's sells Posey's springs. They don't sell their own springs. But why does it matter? Well, depending on what spring you order, the spring tension and the width eye to eye has to match your spring perch side to side mounting position. So what I have found in my research is the narrowest mounting position side to side is 44. The widest I have seen is 48.5 inches. Now, those specs come with springs that you buy. Just go on Speedway or whatever. I mean, you know, there used to be 1,000 shops, but Speedway is sort of the only survivor, and they've bought everybody out basically. So you do want to set your spring perch to the width suggested by the manufacturer. The problem is I don't know who this manufacturer was, and I don't really know what to say about it. All right, basically this is all you need to mount your rear end. You need a mount to hold the spring, you need a shackle, and you need a spring. Now, there's 10,000 combinations of doing this. If you are mounting a transverse rear spring to an axle that does not have spring mounts attached, meaning not an early Ford axle, you're going to be purchasing some version of this, or building one, you know, whatever your jam is. This is designed to go directly on top of the axle, which is the situation we want. There are versions that you may have seen in the Mercury debacle videos where I was trying to mount a spring behind the rear axle, which was the way it was done on later model Fords, I think starting in 35, but I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, this would weld onto the axle and the spring would float behind it. Now, that will indeed get your car significantly lower, which is cool. But in our case, if we mounted the spring behind the rear axle, that would force this entire body forward something like 7 inches so that our spring would still fit in the existing crossmember. If we decided not to force the body forward, we've got to extend the frame backwards 7 inches or so for the spring to catch this crossmember. Those are options for you. If you are cutting and welding your frame, if you're adding a Z, if you're doing any of that stuff, I'm just saying it's an option. For us, we've got to go with the spring mount that goes over the axle. Now, our shackles that we have are 1.5 inch shackles. You can get longer shackles that will actually lower things a little bit for you. But basically, that little archway is the top of our axle tube. So we really can't lower this with our shackles by much, because basically what will happen is the center of our spring eye that is in that end of our shackle will actually bottom out against the axle, which is kind of where my pinky is. This is not the best way to demonstrate it, but I think you guys are sharp enough to follow it. So we have 39.5 eye to eye, and we have 1 inch and 1/2 on our perches times 2, so that's 3 inches. And that gets us to a total width unloaded of 42.5 basically. So, and when we're ideally with the weight of the car and everything spread, we are at a 45-degree angle on our shackles. Why? Because that allows us to go up and to go down as the spring expands and contracts and the car bounces around, right? It's another one of those situations where we're working off the center point, right where my thumb was, of a circle. This is the narrowest our spring will be. That is the widest. And you're trying to get the middle travel to be at about 45 so that you're halfway between the narrowest point if the spring is moving around and the widest point if you hit a really big bump. The issue I'm having right now is I don't know what the spring perch distance wants to be on this. The absolute minimum is 42.5 based on our mathematics, but Model A rear springs for sure always want to be spread out. I'm not exactly sure why, it just preloads the spring or something like that, meaning you spread it out under tension, and then when you put the weight of the car on it, it compresses even more, widening it. So, with the minimum being 44 and the max being 48, this appears to be a lower arch spring. The other dimension that they'll often, try to let you know is how much of an arc there is, and it's to the bottom of the spring. And this one's 13 and change, and that's another thing I can't find anywhere. So this doesn't match anything that's being sold today that I am aware of. It definitely does not look original, so I don't know what it is. Because the next smallest arch I can find is like 15 or so, I think keeping the spring perches narrower makes sense because there's a lot less spring to spread out. That's my logic. Just to keep everybody fully informed here, we're with the shackles, with these 1.5 inch shackles that we have, we are at 42 inches wide in a totally unloaded, totally neutral position. So I think we need to go to at least 44 inches wide on center to our mounts, because if I just push down on this spring, basically if I can move it by putting some weight on it upwards, basically I was able to measure about 1 inch. A car with 1 or 2 people sitting in the back is going to move it significantly more. Now I may need to put these leaves back in to stiffen it up when we get there, but just trying to get an assessment. I think, I don't know. On the Speedway website, it is not uncommon for a 39.5 inch eye-to-eye spring. One of them needs to be stretched out to 46.5, and one of them needs to be stretched out to 48 inches. Meaning, the perches are 46 inches apart or 48 inches apart, which is quite an amount to stretch a spring, but apparently that's super common. It's been a while since I've done this, so I'm just going with what I've read, but I do have to make an executive decision on what kind of spring I have. So I'm debating between a 44 inch wide and a 46 inch wide, kind of spring spread. So what I'm gonna do now to test is I'm gonna pull the spring pack apart, because makes a lot more sense to try to spread a spring when it's only the main leaf. I'm gonna see how flexible that main leaf is, and if it gives it up really easy, I think we're gonna go as wide as 46 inches. I don't think I'm gonna go further than that though. As a single main leaf, if I really got onto it, I could spread it out to about 46 inches wide. So that's what I'm going to go with. Thinking that once I put the spring pack in, it'll be significantly stiffer. The weight of the car will be more, and it needs to carry the weight of gasoline and 2 passengers. Is my best assessment. I think going wider than that to 48 is too far. That's what I'm gonna do. I think everything I'm seeing, I think it'll work. I hope it'll work, because I don't really know how to tell for sure. So I think 44 is too narrow. I think 46 is kind of the, maybe we'll go 46 and a half, because that was the number on the internet for what it should be. And I think 48 and a half is too far. So we're gonna go for right in the middle. Let's drag the rear end out, because that's only half the battle. Like, the distance from side to side is one thing. Now we gotta figure out the spring angle. I know we're at the wrong end of the car, but this is important. So here's the deal. We gotta set the pinion angle. The pinion angle is kind of based on your engine angle, meaning the way that I do things, and this goes back to some article I read 20 years ago and took notes on. This is a hotly debated topic on the internet. But here's what I do, and it's been totally fine for me every time I've done it, so I'm gonna stick with it. The way I do this is I set my engine at 3 degrees down, meaning take an angle finder, grab one, and you land that sucker. See, that sucker is at 0 right now because the intake is not totally flat. When the intake is on a small block Chevy, the way that it is milled, the carburetor will be at 0 degrees when the engine is leaning down roughly 3 degrees, give or take. Now, I don't have a great place to measure because that valve cover is not bolted on, but these are numbers that I just sort of know to be true. So I set my small block Chevy engines at 3 degrees down, AKA flat at the carburetor. And then I need to set my pinion angle 3 degrees up. Now, that creates a straight line. I don't know when the debate started about being off axis or whatever else, but so far I've had no trouble with it, so I'm gonna stick with it. Now, the thing about getting this to 3 degrees up, well, that's easy, right? Oh, of these workbenches and space that I have created for myself, I am still spending a lot of time crawling around on the floor. Anyway, our engine angle, we're calling that 3 degrees down. So what that means is our crankshaft is also going 3 degrees down, transmission 3 degrees down, so our tail shaft on the transmission is 3 degrees down. So I want this to be pointed up, back at that 3 degrees up. Now, that's simple enough, you know? Basically, you get yourself some jack stands and some whatever. Let's say that's magically it. Check it with an angle finder, figure out our thing. Let's pretend that that's 3 degrees. Well, if that's the case, then all you gotta do is put your mount where it goes, make sure it's at 0 degrees front to back, you know, with same angle finder. And if this is flat and this is 3 degrees up, then your spring will be right over your axle, holding everything happily in place. If your frame is level. All right, so we've looked at this as a system, suggesting that if our pinion angle is up 3 degrees and we level our spring mounts, that will hold everything at level. That's just part of it when you're building a hot rod like this. If you have a custom frame and your rear cross member is going to be level, well, you're good to go. If you end up with a rake, rubber or otherwise, you've got one more thing to consider. So for us, we are going to have a rake. We've got a drop axle in the front. In the back, we are going to run taller tires, and we've got to guesstimate how tall our spring arch is going to be fully loaded, because we need to set the frame at the height we think it will be when everything is said and done. That's a lot of educated guessing. And the reason that we need to do that is because the frame right now is raked, we need to know just how much rake we expect, because, let me break out the old iPhone because it's easier to read on camera. All right, I'm not calling that super accurate, but it's a lot easier to read on camera. So let's just say that is 8 degrees right now. So our cross member is at 8 degrees, meaning if we put our spring straight up and down, the cross member is going to do 8 degrees of rotation, and that's going to make our pinion angle 5 degrees down instead of 3 degrees up, because I guarantee you the spring, when it bolts in here, is going to follow that line. All right, so clearly we're gonna have to take more accurate measurements than my phone. It's just easier to read. It has a case on it and buttons on the side, so it's not really accurate. But if those numbers were true, if it's really not level and it's facing down 7 or 8 degrees and our pinion angle is up 3 degrees and we weld our spring mounts right on the top, well, once it goes into this pocket, it's suddenly gonna rotate and our pinion angle is gonna be magically down like 5 degrees instead of 3 degrees up. So we've got to deal with all of that. Well, what does all that mean? Don't forget, guys, everything is connected here. And that's why we kind of got to do it all at once. Meaning, if our ride height in the front goes up, well, then we are going to be leveling out the frame a little bit. If our ride height in the front goes down, we're adding rake. If our ride height in the back from this assumed position up on jack stands actually goes down, well, then we're flattening it out. If the spring we believe is actually going to hold it up a few more inches, well, that increases the angle. And by the nature of these mounts, they're not adjustable. You weld those suckers on. If you try to force it to rotate one way or the other with ladder bars or, you know, some other kind of thing, well, then you're binding the spring or bending the shackles. Which best case scenario, you're just gonna like bind up the spring, and that's, you know, that some of that is okay. It's not great, it'll roughen the ride. But worst case scenario, you actually bend something like a shackle, or you put enough tension that you're gonna cause something to break over time. So we need to do a quick assessment on whether we think the front end is actually going to go up, which, you know, we're assuming its ride height with the engine load and the spring we have and the tire size. And then we need to do a quick assessment on what we think our actual ride height will be on our spring once everything is loaded on there. And then we need to set the frame at that level and then measure it. It's a lot. It is a lot. All right, so for the spring, I gotta get a guess so that I can measure down from my cross member. So I am going to basically, that's about 12 inches from the bottom of the spring pack. All right, so basically, if I try to stretch it out a little bit and measure at the same time, disaster will happen. So it's at about 1 foot. I'll bet that's just barely pushing on it. I'm getting it down to 11 inches. I'm gonna say when this thing is fully spread out, it's probably gonna be about 10 inches or so. I don't know, I just gotta make that guess. I need a number to start with, and there's no way to know without it being fully loaded. And frankly, it's not gonna be fully loaded for a while because I don't have a gas tank and, you know, don't have an interior, so there's other weights. So we're gonna make some assumptions that from here, spread out plus load, we're gonna take 2 more inches out. So we're gonna call it 10 inches. Because I've made the decision to switch to this 273 rear axle, and I'm 98.2% sure I'm gonna run disc brakes, that is going to lock me into 15-inch wheels, because the 16-inch wheels that I have that I wanted to run that are early Ford style will not fit over disc brakes anyway. So we are 86ing the idea of using those. We will keep them for something. Maybe the Roadster, maybe wall hangers, maybe I'll find somebody that's doing a restoration or something. They will find a good home eventually. They're not going anywhere. They're just not gonna go on this car. So we're gonna take these wheels, which are the right size, the 820 15s that I would like to run, and we're gonna stick it on this rear end and see where that goes. Then we will figure out, relative to our spring mounts, what 10.5 inches up to the center of the cross member is, and make sure the frame is sitting at that height. Then we gotta go look at the front. Gang, I have put in a lot of work to keep this place clean, but I'll tell you what, man, I can put stuff right in my own way. Anyway, got this thing in here, at least just rolled under. Look at that chrome cover. Man, that's badass, man. Badass. We're sneaking up on it. What we got to do now is we've got to find a way to measure what we think our spring height settled is going to be, which is basically 10 inches from the top. Ooh, no, it's gonna be 10 inches plus the spring pack. We're gonna average it out. We're gonna call it 10.5 inches. From the inside of our cross member to basically our mount to our lower shackle point, which is gonna be right here. So it's our mount minus about an inch. It's an estimation, it's an educated guess, and that's all we really need to do. But of course, we can't measure straight down from our cross member because we're gonna hit the pumpkin. So let's figure this out. All right, here's the plan, Stans. What I got is this straight edge. Basically, I'm just gonna measure, like I've got it running from one end of the cross member to the other. I'm gonna measure the height at the center of the cross member, and that way I'll be able to add that many inches from this measurement straight down to whereabouts our mounts are going to be. I just don't have enough hands to do that right now, so I'll be back in a second. So I'm doing some more, kindergarten arts and crafts. I'm a creeper here. We're gonna call this the cross member. And this dimension from the flat part of the cross member on this Model A frame is 5 inches. So that's our starting point. Now we got to figure out, so we got our wheels here with our axle, essentially like so, pumpkin. Now we got to figure out this dimension, and then we're going to add our spring measurements and all that stuff. Now, this should be our neutral setup in theory. So off the axle, eyeballing that, we're about an inch taller than our axle right now at neutral. And once we've stretched this out, I think it's gonna end up being about 10.5 tall, which means if everybody's following along, 10.5 inches plus our 1 inch is going to be the height that we want from our axle tube to the center of our cross member. And I say we want, I think that's going to be an accurate representation of where the suspension will sit once it's loaded. That's our educated guess. Educated guess. So 11, what did I say? 11 inches. So based on what we've already learned, that this is 5 inches taller than this, we do 11 minus 5, 6 inches. So what we want is our cross member way up on the inside of our cross member to be 6 inches off our axle. And that should get us somewhere close to all this mathemagicals. Remember, this is a very bizarre spring. I'm not sure what I'm dealing with. So these numbers do not count for your Model A spring because it's unlikely that you have this one. So, but the process should work for any Model A or Model T spring that you have. That's interesting. That's gonna bring our back end down 3 inches from where we sit right now. That's significantly lower. So we're gonna go with that. Now the reality is we might wanna lift this up just a little bit more, but I'm not sure. Maybe to the tune of an inch or so. We're gonna throw a fender on here and see how that looks real quick, just to see. Let's do that, because then we gotta move to the front end because everything's gotta be kind of facsimilated. That is insanely encouraging. And right now, that fender is being held up by a 3x3 piece of wood, which is exactly the amount of suspension travel I would like to have, between 3 and 4 inches, because I want this to ride halfway decent. So yeah, guys, you see that? Holy smokes, that looks really good, and that's about the tire size we want to run. I'm super into this, and it looks great. If my math is right here, we gotta double check our measurements up front, and then we'll be able to pull measurements off the angles we need to set the rear spring. This is a 616, meaning it's 6.00 times 1/6. Early way of doing tire sizes. It just means it's 6 inches wide, and it is on a 16-inch rim. Now, a 616 typically has around a 29 point something 30-inch diameter. 30-inch diameter is what we'll call it. Because we're going to switch to 15s and run 15s, we want a skinnier tire in addition to not as tall a tire up front, so that we have a wider tire and a taller tire in the back. So in the back, we're going to run an 820/15, which is 8.20 inches wide by 15, and has a taller overall diameter than our front tire. Now, I have a set of 620/15s, and I am thinking about buying the 560/15s. We'll see what I decide to do. Both of the tire sizes I'm looking at are between 26 and 27 inches in diameter. Now, this one should be about 30 inches in diameter, and you can look all this up on Coker Tire or anywhere else on the internet. So what that should mean in theory is that because this tire diameter is in theory 3 inches taller than what we're going to run, we need to lower the front end 1 1/2 inches, which is half of 3 inches, because half of the difference is above the spindle and half of the difference is below the spindle. I know it's obvious, but it's also worth pointing out if you don't, you know, it's one of those like, oh, right, of course. However, this tire is missing a lot of air. So all I'm going to do is measure to the center of the spindle, because that's the number I actually need. And that center of the spindle is at 13 1/4, which means that's 26 1/2 diameter tire represented right here. So between 26 and 27, depending on what I'm looking for, this is more than close enough. Now, because I spent all the time drawing those cartoons and we are up here, we've just lowered the back effectively 4 or so inches. So the frame is just rotated downwards. And because, remember in the wishbone in the cartoon, the pivot point's back there. So it's several feet back. Like lowering the front, lowering the rear end did very little to affect this point because the tire is sitting right there. But it exponentially affects everything in between. So basically, if we lowered the back of the frame, let's call it 6 inches to make math easy, well then we lowered the center of the frame 3 inches, we lowered the front of the frame where the front tire is 0 inches. So we did move our pivot point for our wishbone, which is just barely mocked up. It came down. It's not quite at the center of the frame, so it's not quite 3 inches, but don't think, you know, that 2 inches is an insignificant amount for that. It's a really big deal. And that's what I meant about trying to figure out everything all at once. All right, so the car is looking pretty good. Our rake is looking pretty good. Our fender clearance is looking pretty good. We're in the neighborhood. I don't think we'll end up any lower than this, but if we need to go a little higher, it may affect what we're doing about a degree or so, but hopefully not much. Really, let's say we came back up 1 inch over 103 inches. You know what I'm saying? We can do the math on it. I'm not gonna bother because I simply just don't know where we're gonna end up. It's sort of like futile, but I'm just saying that's how you can figure this out. So the next step is to take this rake and figure out in our cross member what the angle of our cross member is in this plane, because we want to compensate for that, because that is going to indeed affect how our spring fits in that channel, and our spring wants to be lined up with it. So vertical spring like we were looking at, but we need to turn it just a little bit to what we think our final rake is going to be. Now, for those of you extra astute out there, that will actually rotate our wheelbase back just a hair, because we're not perpendicular anymore, and we're coming down like 10 inches at a couple degrees. Everything is rotation here. So I'm going to accept that. The only other option really, and if you're building a custom frame, is to go ahead and make your rake on your frame, and then you flatten your cross member to earth, and your spring will go straight down. See what I'm saying? Like, that's how you do that. That's how that works. So, yeah. Because this is what we always need to do, I have measured the angle of the rake of the frame in several places. I measured it on what's left of this cross member. I've tried to measure it on the frame rail itself. I've measured it kind of at the top of this cross member, but it is rounded a little bit, and back here. And I'm getting between 3 degrees and 7 degrees, depending on where I measure it. There is going to be enough forgiveness in here that it's gonna be okay. But it's worth accounting for. I mean, the top of a Model A frame is pretty flat all the way down. The bottom does have some whoop-de-doos. So I just need to choose a number now. And I'm thinking, I want my pinion to be 3 degrees up. Maybe I just need to do it at 6 degrees. That's the bare minimum. And then that way what'll happen is the axle will rotate forward as the spring goes in, so it will go from 6 degrees up to 3 degrees up, and the spring will be at a 3 degree angle. Hopefully in that pocket, seated nice and happy, because, you know, it's got a little bit of a rake to it, and once everything's all bolted in, it's gonna go to that, because that's what it's gonna do. All right, team, so the rear end is pulled back a little bit. I'm trying to keep it as close to the car so I can save the old back, you know, from dragging this thing in and out. Strange things are happening with this rear end, meaning that the pinion is not rotating downwards like it should be. It just means, hopefully, that the brakes are a little screwed. It's a bonus for me right now, but it's gonna be a hassle for me in the long run. The brakes are seized on this 9-inch. This is how rear ends normally behave. Like, the pinion's real heavy, it just tilts down until it hits the ground and rotates on the drums. But not our situation here. So now we gotta do a couple of things. We've got to figure out our, I think, 46.5 inches center to center on the eyes of our spring perches. Now, when I do that, I measure in from the backing plates, and there's a good reason for that. Center on your chunk, your pumpkin, your that is not always center. Exempla gratia. Here we are. This is also known as a peg leg 9-inch, where the center section is offset, and beyond that being offset, where the pinion is coming out, where the yoke comes out, is even further off center. I'm not sure why Ford did this, but they did. So there it is. I think it's centered on a 10 bolt, but either way, to be sure, we need our spring centered between the wheels so we can go off the backing plates instead of from the center out. That's what we're gonna do. All right, so the next thing we gotta do, this is our bracket to hold our spring on. Well, we're gonna mark our axle for the weld point, which is down here, but the point we need to measure is the center of this eye. So we need to get the difference between, we'll pick a side, say the back side of this, and the center of the eye. And the way I'm gonna do that is like that. Holding that down flush, that is 1.25 inches, or darn close enough for our measurements. So we need 46.5 inches eye to eye. This is 1.25 inches. That means we need 49 inches outside to outside. I'm adding 1.5 inches to the 46.5. Let's keep doing some math. We'll make some notes here. All right, forgive my scribbles, but we're going for 46.5 inches eye to eye. Why? Well, because I was able to do some measurements as I pushed down on my main leaf, and I was able to find at least one spring on the Speedway website that was being sold as a narrowed Model A spring that is 46.5 eye to eye perch mounts. Does that mean that's what that is? Nope, have no idea, but it is a number that kind of makes sense with the experimentation I did. It's a solid number for me. I'm gonna try it. Now, 1.25 inches on either side, so 1.25 inches times 2 gives me 49 inches outside to outside on my brackets. So now I've got to center 49 inches between these two backing plates. Should be simple enough. We may find a better place to measure from, but let me just get the original general idea. I'm gonna go from the backing plate, just really pick a point. It doesn't make any difference so long as you can repeat it and it's symmetrical on both sides. I'm getting 54.25 inches. All right, let's do some math. 1.25, for those of you following way too closely, I just went off this edge on this backing plate to this edge over here. Find some spot that you can match on your own sort of rear axle. And then we're 49 to 49 on the outside, so minus 49 inches. That leaves us with 5 1/4 inches. And then obviously we've got to divide this by 2 5/8 per side. So in theory, all I've got to do is come in off of this edge 2 5/8 on both sides. That's relatively simple. The idea is, you know, the reason I didn't go off of, you know, the flange over here on the axle is this is in the way. And so I'm looking for a more accurate measurement. So we'll be able to pull our tape measure, grab a carpenter square, and we'll be pretty darn close. I'm gonna go ahead and mark 2 5/8 from even the wrong place, because what I need to do is grind out a whole bunch of this so that we're absolutely hitting bare, happy, fresh steel. Because we gotta weld this thing on, and this is one of those, like, you know, on the scale factor of instant death when your weld breaks. This is way up there. Your axle may not come flying off or go totally cattywampus if your ladder bars or radius rods hold it in the right place, but you'll be experiencing some severe changes in your driving conditions. These need to be good welds. There is no going back to get this later. So yeah, we gotta clean it up real good like. All right, so I actually did it right. I went ahead and cleaned these up. I ground all the crud and everything off of those. I put a mild bevel on the inside because these are 3/8, which is pretty darn thick, and we want as much of a good weld as we possibly can get. Now, I am gonna weld both sides of it, but realistically, if I burn through 3/8 plate on this axle tube, I'm gonna bust a huge hole in the axle tubes. I think the axle tubes maybe 1/4 inch at best. Somebody that knows this stuff can actually say what that is, but I've seen 9 inches and stuff get, you know, shortened, and they are not nearly this thick. So, so we will do our best on that. Gave the axle an initial cleanup. We'll take a look here in a second if we're exactly in the right spot, because the way we're gonna set our angle is rotating this guy on our axle tube. Know what I'm saying? All right, gang, I gotta make my mark here at 2 5/8. I went ahead and did it, but I didn't have enough hands to get this whole thing going. So to show you how I did it, it was the simplest way I could think of. I took my combination square, set it to 2 5/8, ran that against the backing plate where I'd taken my initial measurement from, and then in order to keep this thing from swinging, I basically got it lined up, measured my distance off the back of the axle. I got 3 1/8, and I measured it back here, lined that up at 3 1/8, made my mark. That meant that this line was square to the axle, this was square to there. Close enough for government work, ladies and gentlemen. So now, in theory, I can take this line and transfer it off the backing plate. So let's just call that 2 7/8, which means I can come off this flange 2 7/8 and make a couple marks, and I should be in pretty good shape to make a straight line potentially all the way around the axle. And the 2 7/8 mark should transfer directly over to the other side. In fact, I can even use this thing as a template. Got 2 marks, line them up. That's basically my outside edge. That's where she goes. And then we just got to make this thing straight up and down, which is a whole different set of tools. So let's transfer this mark to the other side. We'll double check and go on to the next step. All right, this is our first checkpoint. We've got some rinky-dink Harbor Freight welding magnets holding these things up. Square, sure, whatever, close enough. If this is in the right place, it's sitting on this brake line holder honor thing, so we're gonna have to 86 that, which is fine. We can, you know, we'll be fine. But with these 2 things in place, I can check 2 measurements. I can check eye to eye, which is I want to be 46.5, and I can come off the backing plate to the eye on both sides and make sure that we are indeed equal. So here's where I'm starting. I've double checked the frame in several places. I'm seeing roughly 3 degrees. Now, this is a basic angle slope finder. If you have a digital one, good on you. Use that, use whatever you want. This is a pretty good guess for me, just in general, because I think that the rake is more likely to go up than it is to decrease, but I don't 100% know, you know? Anyway, we are going to go with our 3 degree up pinion angle, and we are going to add 3 degrees to it, so that is a 6 degree angle at the pinion. And when this thing is up 6 degrees and our perches are level, then we are going to be, we're going to be in good shape. And we'll tack weld them on with the assumption that when we install this in the car, the spring is going to be straight up and down when we're done welding, and then it's going to rotate to go into this pocket right here in the cross member that we're going to hope is at the same angle as the rest of our frame, which we're calling 3 degrees right now. Everybody follow? All right, gang, that's how I like to do it. I put the little measuring device on the actual yoke, measure it from there, and set it. So I'm a little low right now. Gotta rotate this thing up, and then I will put a jack stand under it, shim it till I'm happy, and then we're good to go. Now, you will notice that I am not doing anything to level it this way because I don't care. All right, here's a tip for you fellas that are working with these kit parts like I am. These Speedway perches, they look like they don't fit. You can see there's kind of a gap under there, and you're gonna be like, oh, heavens to Murgatroyd, why didn't they make it right? Now I gotta grind it all down to make it fit. No, you just gotta tap it with a hammer and it will actually settle right on there and hold, you know, kind of tight, which is nice. So I've been measuring things for almost 15 minutes straight, and I'm not kidding you. It's like really just triple checking everything. So we've got 6 degrees here on the yoke up. We've got 0 degrees on the top of this guy. We've got 0 degrees on the top of this guy. I got 46.5 eye to eye. And I've also measured off the backing plate to both sides of each perch to make sure that they are not twisted one way or the other. That was quite a task because that moved everything. I am counting on these little fellers here to be square enough. Just because of the shape of the thing, it's kind of my best bet. You know, in theory, you could try to put a level on this, but that only counts if you've already leveled your axle, which I have not done. So, I think it's time. I think I gotta don the old welding jacket and tack these in and commit to it. Commitment's frightening in many forms, boys. First step in the plan, do not knock the rear end. Steady, steady. All right, so the biggest thing about this is you gotta be real gentle when you connect your ground. In fact, I may just have to hold it on for this first tack, which I don't like to do, but I'm gonna. Plan of attack is to tack weld it right here in the center. So in theory, if the weld, you know, as it cools, it's going to shrink. So if it pulls it out of square or whatever, it's gonna pull it, rotating it down toward the center of the axle, and then we'll just tap it back in. So that's our goal here, is get enough stickum that we can tap it with a hammer back into place and add a couple more tacks. Actually looks like it stayed pretty straight, which is great. So we're gonna do the other side. The reality is, once we're done tacking it, we're gonna double check all of our measurements again, and then we're gonna add some more tack welds, because even these tack welds have to hold the weight of the car and the tension of the spring. We have to stretch this spring to fit between these two things, which means there's gonna be a bunch of tension kind of pulling them as well. So these tacks have to be better than your average bear. All right, gang, our measurements still check out. We're still doing pretty good. So let's go ahead and add a couple more tacks to the front, and a couple more tacks on the back, and see if we can get our spring in there. All right, that's the thing. Is it perfect? Probably not. Will it work? Hopefully so. Maybe I got it all wrong. We'll find out sooner than later, you know? So 5 pretty big tacks on these things. I think it'll hold the spring. I'll find out. I don't know if we got that in me tonight. Maybe it's time to clean up, do a little bit of a fire watch, make sure there's anything on fire, and yeah, try some spring stretching tomorrow. Captain's log, 6 a.m. Got a cup of little brown dog coffee. The task of the morning is not a good one for the morning. Basically, we got to use our brain pans to avoid injury. Here's what we got to do. The goal is to come up with an ingenious way to stretch this spring. Now, it's not the world's most tension spring when it's all apart like this. We got to go about 2.5 inches or so from our shackle to our mount. We are already kind of lined up over there. Now, the traditional way to do this, now if you had a stock spring that wasn't reversed eye, this is a stock eye Model T spring. They make a spring spreader, slash Ford made a spring spreader that would hook in under the eye, and it would either be like a hydraulic thing or a turning thing, and you know, it would function like a turnbuckle and open it up. So we've just got to come up with something clever. I've got a few ideas. I have no idea which one will work. We're gonna go with the simplest ideas first. So with the main leaf apart, one of the ways I came to this measurement, not knowing the origin of the spring, was I basically like lay the tape measure stretched out, and then I leaned on the spring and I like watched where it's spread out. So I think it's safe to say that, you know, with me leaning on it, that's half a Ryan unit, which is somewhat equal to, you know, about 100 US pounds or so. So we're not talking about monstrous amounts of pressure to get this thing right. So the plan here is I'm gonna see if this great big clamp, oh, we're not gonna fit, are we? Oh, do you wanna do it? Getting there. All right, step right up. So we're basically halfway in, a little more. The idea is I'm gonna take a deep well socket that fits the size of the bushing, but the shackle bolt can slide right through. All right, that's it. Putting the plate on and tightening them down will get everything else seated. So we're gonna get there, and you know, let's move on to the other side, get this far, and then we'll do the rest. All right, there you have it. We're in, did this exactly the same way as we did this other side. Now I'm gonna leave this tension, because if I took this tension completely off, anything this is doing to help is keeping these from spreading out. So let's find our shackle end thingies, which I don't know where they are, but I know I have them. Try to get those things on. Then we gotta get the leaf pack back together. All right, now for my next trick, we gotta get these things on, which feels like it should be simple, but you can see right now that they don't actually line up. That the spring tension, even with the clamp still on it, is pulling this end apart. So it's relatively simple enough. It is kind of hard to get a purchase on these things sometimes. All right, gang, we missed a moment of truth. So I just used the 2-clamp method, which is I put a clamp, this kept sliding off, sliding up the bracket because there was nothing to catch on. So I just put a C-clamp for our other clamp to catch on, squeezed it tight, and there we go. So I gotta find the nuts for these, which I've lost a long time ago. This will at least kind of get us there. Gentle bit of persuasion, do not hit the threads. I'm gonna go ahead and put the spring pack back together because I don't want to do that when I get back home. When I get back home tonight, we gotta save all our energy for lifting this body up enough to fit the spring pack under and slide it in there, which is gonna be a wrestling match. Random orbit sander, 120 grit. I'm just gonna hit it because it's rough. Then I'm gonna slather it in all-purpose grease, whale bearing grease, chassis grease, whatever. I'm not worried about the paint. I will rattle can it after it's all done because what I care about is the grease, and we'll just clean up the edge, then spray it down. the grease is going to do a better job of protecting this thing than, say, even the paint. Here we go. I have a relatively clean garage, definitely for me. And yet, I've got myself shoehorned in between two rear axles. Like, the one behind me probably needs to find a new home. Not my favorite gear ratio, and somebody out there wants a 9-inch. I usually am lazy and just do this with my bare hand, and then have a big, you know, disgusting time trying to get myself cleaned up. I don't know if you've ever seen like a real 20s or 30s car that's original, but the grease packs like had leather pouches that wrapped around them and like a Zerk fitting, and man, they were just, there was no such thing as too much grease. Probably still isn't. This again, I don't know how well that's gonna work. We're just gonna jump right to the future after I've sanded all these things and greased them up. Now, as far as the grease goes, first of all, if you're running an old Model A spring, you need to re-grease it. And if you're running a brand new spring, they get shipped bone dry. And considering you gotta blow it apart anyway to get it actually put together, you gotta go through this process. I mean, after all, you know, you can see by the nature of it, it's got a center pin here to hold the pack together. Then you got two mounts where my hands are on the cross member. And then as these go up and down, they all slide relative to each other. The better these things slide, the less they bind, the, you know, less stiff and jarring your ride's gonna be. And hot rod suspension is pretty hard to make comfortable. This may have had a mini leaf on the top that I lost a long time ago, but we're gonna try with 6 leaves, which is, once again, this is the, I think it's the whole pack, but again, I cannot identify the origin of this spring. Use some clamps to help it. We're gonna tighten all of this up, and then you can put your clamps on it and swap out your big threaded thing for a regular center bolt. So, all right, gang, I'm back. I'm lost in time. I don't know when I am anymore. I was here at 6 a.m. putting the spring together, went to work for 10 hours. I'm back at sometime around 8 p.m. But yeah, it's time to try to shove this thing in here, put it into our cross member, and hope our welds hold, which I think they will. I think they will. This is a great project if you got a couple of buddies to like call them over and trade them a beer, because then you can have a buddy on each side of the body. They lift up the rear end, you just roll the sucker under there, and they set it back down, and you guys sit around and look at it. We are decidedly and notoriously buddyless here Between the Sharks Garage, so we're gonna do it ourselves. You will see that this thing needs to go up quite a bit in order for it to sneak under the cross member. The cross member has the, but the body does not. All right, that may not be the best plan, but it worked. We're up on jack stand. So the goal now, I'm just gonna try to rotate it down and sneak it under, because the cross member is higher than this, so this ought to do it. But hey, at least I didn't try to like lift it and roll it under at the same time, which really was my first instinct. All right, now we're talking. We're not at the same time. Nope. Gotta watch your paint. All right, next trick is lowering it back down and getting that spring actually centered in there, and also hoping that these welds don't break. And then once everything's kind of settled, we get to double check everything and see if we screwed it all up and it has to come back out and we have to cut the welds and redo our angles. Let's hope not. How are we feeling? Not that lucky. Holy smokes, this never happens. Look at that. Look how close that is. I wonder if I can just give this a jostle. Oh, too much jostle. All right, there we go, lined up. That never happens. All right, we're getting a little bit of angle to our dangle here. We want this to be about 45, but no seats, no gas tank, no battery, no people. So far, we're looking okay. All right, gang, I gotta be super honest with you. There is still plenty of rotation. I got the jack under it. I was trying to just see. So without the spring fully clamped in and without anything actually holding it in place like radius rods or hairpins, there's enough room, which is making it very difficult for me to tell exactly where it wants to be. But just moving it around with the jack just to see what was binding, I do have more than enough flexibility to adjust the pinion angle a little bit. So I'm gonna call it okay for now. All right, gang, we got some good news and some bad news. Clearly, the wheel's too far back, but I'm showing 106-inch wheelbase. It should be a 103-inch wheelbase on this car. I could correct this by moving the body. Bam, done. But if that's not the problem, if it's the way that I like wedged, you know, the rear end under, and it's not as vertical as it needs to be, that would swing this rear end forward, because I basically rolled the rear end down and then rolled it back into place. So maybe, you know, maybe I need to jack the frame up and see if the wheels will like roll in and straighten themselves out. I'm not really sure how much play there is inside the crossmember with the spring, but I'll bet it's enough. I mean, we've got a lot of flexible points in here between the spring, the shackles, you know, and like normally on an early Ford, the radius rods would locate this in that way and keep, like, the weight of the car is going to want to roll the axle back out from under it. We're in the ballpark. I decided to clamp these shackles together, which is really important. We're gonna start pushing and pulling on stuff because these will twist if they're not all anchored together, and I didn't have the hardware, so that's fine. Got a little clamp holding the spring in the cross member. And then I decided to put ratchet straps, you know, basically something with pulling power, but not like pulling power, not like brake stuff pulling power. Something you do, like a come along would be way too much in my opinion. Because if you're using a come along and it's taking all that effort, something's wrong, like very wrong. I lifted a little weight off the body with the jack, and then I kind of just tweaked with the ratchet straps. I made some marks on the ground till I got it to 103.5 inches. So 103.5 inches is what I just interneted. And that seems to be the wheelbase. Things are lined up. Eyeballing it at that wheelbase. I did put the angle finder on it. I think it's at 2 degrees up, which we were aiming for 3. That's not bad. 1 degree of adjustment, I can put that kind of twist in ladder bars if I have to. The spring is moving. It's really stiff, but that may just be the leaf pack. I don't know. It's never had weight on it. So, you know, worst case, we did put the spring perches too far wide, but I feel pretty good about it considering we're at a mild angle and it's not loaded yet. I think we're gonna get down to a 45-degree angle. And if I put the spring perches too far in, it would already be compressing. You know what I'm saying? So things are looking kind of good. I haven't put the fender back on, and I'm not going to right now because I want to get this firmed up. And the simple reality is, I mean, I'm excited to do the fenders, but if the wheel well is not centered in the fender, what we're going to do is put the fender on the body the way we want to, move the whole body back till we feel like it's right, and then I'll decide. That may shift the front fenders and stuff backwards, and if I don't want to do that because I want to keep them where I did them in the last video, I'll just make a piece and we'll fill in the back gap. That's not undoable. It's brutal out here. It's August right now, and it's hot and the mosquitoes are hungry. I know. I'm like Jason, I just won't stay dead. But I gotta show you this. I I was trying to clean up, and you know what I mean? You know how it goes. But check that out. That's at ride height, sitting on its own suspension. I got the fender jacked up with a jack a little bit to hold the back up, a clamp in the front. Not only does it fit kind of nicely, you know, we're in the neighborhood of 3.5 inches of travel. I got a 4x4 in there, which is 3.5 by 3.5. It looks sharp, and my front fenders are still moved forward. Right now, I'm super excited about that. It's gonna cause me so many problems, but man, that looks good. I thought I was gonna have a lot more to do here and that we were gonna have to move everything back and whatever else, but it turns out a lot of what we did is working. I haven't figured out what problems we have yet, but this is all a good sign. Every once in a while, you hit a lick. I'm not trying to jinx myself. All these projects are 2 steps forward, 1 step back, if not 2 steps forward, like 28 steps back. So hang in there, gang. I'm gonna take this as a win for tonight. Tomorrow I will discover all the problems with it and we'll fix those too. Thanks for watching Between the Sharks. We'll see you next time.